Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about expressions of interest, EOIs, and this is an offer that you would submit to a seller when you're interested in buying their business. However, it's a little bit different than an LOI, a letter of intent. So that's what we're going to be talking about today and understanding the value of when an EOI makes sense. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the definition, comparing the differences between an EOI and an LOI, understanding what to include in an EOI, what are the key sections, talking a little bit about the mistakes that a lot of buyers make when they put together an EOI, and then also understanding the timeline. When is an EOI submitted, and what follows next, and when do I submit an LOI following that? So these are kind of the things that we'll talk about, and then in a part 2 video, I'm going to be taking a real-life example of an EOI document that I receive in my day-to-day business as a business broker and walking you through the sections and helping you understand and putting some words to some of these topics. So make sure to check out that video as well. So an expression of interest, an EOI, is a preliminary offer submitted by a buyer which communicates their interest in acquiring the business and providing a very high-level summary of what they envision the offer to look like. You know, what's my valuation range? Here's kind of what I'm thinking in terms of structure. Here's what I need, and here's kind of the timeline I expect if I were to go and pursue this business. And it's really more of a first test that a seller and a broker uses to really qualify a buyer. So EOIs are really a qualifier in terms of making sure that you get that buyer to commit to putting their idea on paper around how do I envision buying this business. So an EOI is not the same as an LOI because an LOI is more of a formal offer. You know, they spent a lot of time, they've done their due diligence, and that's really the final offer that they would submit to the seller, and they would expect the seller to sign back and to enter into exclusivity with that buyer. So an EOI doesn't seek exclusivity. It doesn't seek a sign back. Really, all that you're doing is you're putting a structure of what you envision your LOI to look like, but earlier on in the process so that, it's a bit of a qualifier. And so this is a really good way to, one, confirm that there's genuine interest in the business from the seller's point of view, and to ensure that you're not wasting each other's time, that, they're just kicking tires and they have no interest in putting an LOI in place, but also to get a general sense of where the buyer's expectations are and comparing that to where, if you're the advisor selling a business or if you're the seller, where are my expectations? And then having a very frank conversation. So especially in my day-to-day business as an M&A advisor, we run auctions where we contact, a broad range of buyers and really start providing information to them. But we can't talk to all of those buyers the entire way through until they get an LOI. So what we do is, 4 to 6 weeks after we give information, we say, please submit an EOI to confirm whether you're really interested or, oh, thanks for the information, but I'm going to pass on this one. And you whittle down the field to people that have put together EOIs that meet or closely meet the seller's expectations. And those are the ones that you continue working on to get an LOI, so that you kind of cut and whittle down that buyer group to a few key buyers that are really a good fit for that seller. So, we've kind of talked about the differences, but, here are really the 5 key differences between an EOI and an LOI. The first one I already mentioned is LOIs require a sign back. So when I, as a buyer, submit an LOI, I don't expect any follow-on negotiation. That's really my final offer. We've already gone through the song and dance, and now I expect that if I meet your expectation or if you like my offer, you'll sign it back and we'll enter into exclusive negotiations where I can then do my final due diligence, go into legals, and close that transaction. An EOI, that's not the case. There is no sign back. The second thing is the amount of due diligence required for an LOI. So for EOIs, they're preliminary offers. A buyer maybe has spent, 2, 4, 6 weeks reviewing the information that's been provided by the seller, but they still have time and a lot more work to do in terms of due diligence to get really comfortable with the business. So they may need more information on customers, suppliers, industry data, touring the business and the facility. So there are other things that are required before they can submit a final detailed letter of intent. But for an EOI, what they're doing is they're taking the assumptions and the preliminary information that's been given by the broker and the seller and saying, based on this information, this is where I believe I would be in terms of value and structure and all that. So again, it's more preliminary. You're not spending as much time in terms of due diligence. Now, the third difference is the offer price. Very rarely do we see an EOI with a fixed number. I'm giving you $10 million, I'm giving you $2 million. No, that's not the case. Typically, an EOI has a range. I expect my valuation range to be between 2 million and 2.5 million, or 4 million and 4.75 million, giving a range. Whereas with an LOI, that's not the case. It's kind of like bidding on a house. I'm giving you a fixed number, and that's really what's expected in an LOI stage. Whereas with an EOI stage, it's more just providing the structure and general assumptions. And if you're within the range of where the seller wants to sell the business, then you can proceed and continue having discussions. But obviously, if that range is far out or not within the seller's expectations, then let's not waste each other's time. Let's move forward, move on, and terminate discussions now. Now, the fourth comment is the purchase price structure. So typically with an EOI, you would allude to, hey, I think I'm going to need some vendor financing. There may be an earnout. Maybe I want you to hold back 10% of the business, but we're really talking in percentage, high level terms with no real specifics. I'm not going to, provide a detailed schedule of the amortization or the interest or the types of terms around the deferred compensation. I'm just giving you more the high level. I believe I'm going to give you 70% up front and then 30% deferred. And my value is $4 to $5 million. Well, that's enough at that stage, right? Because you can't really give a lot of detail because you haven't spent the time as the buyer. But again, from the seller's point of view, all they care about is that you're within the vicinity of what they expect in terms of value. And then the last thing is closing details. So for EOIs, maybe very briefly, you would describe, I expect to close this in 90 days after I sign an LOI. This is kind of my process and structure, but there's not a lot of detail around net working capital, reps and warranties, and different types of closing conditions that an LOI would have. It's much more high level because, again, the expectation is that this is just a first offer to get me into the next stage of the process and to keep the discussion moving forward. So what are the key sections? We've kind of already talked about them. The first is you want to always give a background on who you are as a buyer, what you've done in the past in terms of companies that you've owned or businesses that you've managed, in addition to the rationale, the reason why you're interested in this transaction. Think of this as the first formal proposal that a seller is going to read, because the reality is a seller may get multiple EOIs and they'll read through all of those documents. And it's not just comparing the numbers, but comparing the people that they want to continue down this path with. And if you're not a buyer group that's qualified or has never owned a business before, you have to communicate a lot of credibility, right? Whereas people that have done this before, they have that credibility and will win the seller's favor more quickly. So it's important to take time to communicate who you are as a group and the rationale behind the deal. Then, as we discussed, you want to put a value range, not a specific number, because you don't want to kind of tie yourself in. You want to have the wiggle room at this stage to say, I think this business is worth $4 to $4.5 million. And here's my reason why. I believe the EBITDA is 1, and I'm giving this 4 to 4.5 times multiple on that sustainable EBITDA. So you kind of allude to the valuation approach, what you're thinking in terms of an EBITDA multiple, and what that translates to in terms of a purchase price. And that is enough detail at this stage for an EOI. In terms of the transaction structure, again, we're not talking about specific terms. It's more just high-level percentage split. I expect to give you 70% cash down. There's going to be 30% vendor note, or there will be 20% vendor note with a 10% earnout. So kind of walking through different structures, but not putting a lot of details around that because, again, you don't know what type of security or what the seller's comfort is around performance-based targets. So those are things that you will continue to discuss with the seller, but you put the structure in place today in the EOI. In terms of the cash versus debt split, this is an important one. You want to quickly communicate your credibility in terms of being able to close. How much cash do I have? Do I need to raise any financing from outside investors? How much debt financing? Do I have relationships with the banks, et cetera, et cetera? As well, the timeline. Again, all you really want to communicate here is that here are the things that I still need to do due diligence on. Again, I'm giving you an offer. It's based on these assumptions, but I need to confirm these assumptions. So these are the areas that I really want to look into in the next stage and when I want to close on this transaction. And then that goes into the closing timeline. When do I expect to close this deal? Am I someone that's moving quick or slow? Then, as well, a key aspect of an EOI is the confidentiality. So, A, you can't disclose this EOI to anyone else. You can't share it with anyone outside of your advisors. And then B, this is non-binding, very similar to a letter of intent. Even though you don't have to sign anything, by me putting this EOI, I'm interested in continuing these discussions. Here's my idea, but you're not binding me to anything, and it can totally change the structure at any time in the process. So it's important to add those statements in. And then lastly, there are more seller-specific things. So I always recommend that you talk to the seller or the broker if they're represented and say, what are you looking for in an EOI? What are kind of the high-level things that I need to touch on? And that could be, management wants to retain some equity or reinvest into the equity blocks. So addressing how that looks. What is the expected transition of the seller? Well, I have a lot of experience, but I still think the seller needs to stay on for 12 months. Are you okay with that? And you're providing that dialogue. Because really all of the discussion points in the EOI are going to be reviewed by the seller and they're going to have an opinion on, so that the next time you meet them, you have that dialogue and that script to go through each of these points and discuss them in detail. Another one is if the seller owns the property. I want to lease the property for 5 years with an option to extend for 5 or 2 plus 2 or whatever the case is. You're kind of guiding them in terms of what they expect to lease the property to you for. Then also talk about net working capital in terms of, how much net working capital I'm looking for, what's the methodology around working capital, but not negotiating it, because net working capital negotiations are for later on. All you really want to communicate now is educate the seller that, hey, you're going to have to leave some net working capital behind, and here's in general terms the methodology that I would use to approach net working capital. Okay. Now, what are some common mistakes? I get a ton of EOIs, right? I typically sell about 20 businesses a year. Each of those businesses will get anywhere from 10 to 20 EOIs. So I see a ton of them. And one of the problems I have is the very first one, it's something that I very commonly see for first-time business buyers is, they don't really understand the concept of the EOI. Yes, you can give a valuation range, but that range can't be too broad. So I just recently saw an EOI where it was a very broad valuation range, and that's not meaningful to the seller because they don't understand. Okay, well, the bottom end of that range is outside of my expectations. Near the top end, that's within the range. So can I take you seriously? Because the bottom end, we shouldn't even have a discussion, but the top end, we should, right? So if your valuation range is, you call it 3 to 5 million or 10 to 20 million, that's just not meaningful to the seller because how do I gauge what you really think the value of this business is? Whereas if it's a tighter range, you're kind of guiding towards a specific multiple vicinity without giving an exact number. So I typically focus on turns of EBITDA. Realistically, the range should be at most maximum 1 turn of EBITDA. Because the more turns of EBITDA, the broader the range is and the less meaningful that indication of valuation is. Whereas, really expert buyers or people that have done this in the past, they're comfortable in giving you half of a turn in terms of buffer. So it could be 4 to 4.5 times or 4 to 5 times. But if you do 4 to 7 times, it's just you're not sending it the right message to the seller. The other one is not enough detail. You spend a lot of time on valuation, but there's nothing in terms of the structure, the equity check, the debt financing, the transition and the equity investment from management, all these other considerations that are meaningful to the seller. So it's always important to, again, have that conversation with the broker, understand what the seller is looking for, and address those details in the EOI. If you don't address them and, you simply say, well, I can't give you my guidance right now, I don't know where my head is at, well, then you're defeating the purpose of the EOI. The EOI is a starting point in terms of discussion. It's not the end. And that's the other thing, the unwillingness to adjust the offer. Sometimes people see an EOI like an LOI and they treat it as, well, if I give you this, this is my final number. That's not the case. This is really just addressing high-level structure, and it's a starting point in terms of formal discussions that you put on paper beyond just traditional conversations over the phone. So, realistically, you need to put some detail. You need to have some meat on the bone for the seller to say, okay, I understand the way they're thinking about this transaction. Because if you don't have detail, what ends up happening is A, the broker has to come back to you and ask for that detail. And B, if you're not willing to give it, then you probably won't succeed in terms of passing and progressing on to the next stage of the process. The other one is too much diligence up front. So some people, again, I go back to treating an EOI like an LOI, they want to confirm everything now. They, instead of taking the assumptions at face value and saying, I'll substantiate these later, what they're doing is they're taking them now and trying to do the due diligence right now. And unfortunately, that's not productive, because the reality is that's not the point of an EOI. So don't spend the time now, because realistically, all you're doing is you're lowering the value of your brand with the seller, because you're seen as high maintenance. As why spend the time now? We'll talk about these things at a later stage in the process. Another mistake here is the EOI to LOI conversion. So for buyers that are sending out multiple EOIs, or they're dealing with the business broker on multiple files, I always pay attention to, if I've worked with a buyer group, they've submitted 4 EOIs on 4 of my files, how many of those EOIs have led to LOIs? And I think of a few buyers where they're always really eager to put in an EOI to really go to the next stage, but they never follow through with an LOI. So their conversion rate's really low. Well, then that buyer's and their brand, it's not serious enough, and we don't take them serious enough anymore, because we know, hey, they don't convert. They're not really taking that EOI and walking it to the finish line. Whereas professional buyers, they're very attentive to the fact that, hey, if I put in an EOI, I'm serious. I'm not a tire kicker. I want to go on to the next stage and follow through with the process. So just make sure to manage your branding, especially when you're dealing with multiple different sellers represented by, the same group of, business brokers. And then the last one is adjusting the valuation down. I see this as really a very difficult situation where, say, for example, you come in at $10 million on the EOI, and then, throughout that process, you walk that back to $7 million. Well, it's very counterproductive, because at the end of the day, the whole point is to make sure that you're within the same range. If you walk back the valuation and try to hammer the LOI down, then you've wasted everyone's time, because at the $7 million level, you would have never been let through anyways. So why are you lowering your valuation? So make sure not to retrade down on EOIs to an LOI. You can go up a little bit, and that's good to see, especially as you get more information and you get more comfortable with the opportunity, but avoid going down from the EOI to the LOI valuation, because then that's really counterproductive, and it also sends the wrong message. Imagine that I'm the seller. I've taken more and more time with you. I've toured the facility with you. I've showed you this information. You gave me an initial $10 million value, and you come back 30% lower. Well, you're almost sending a negative message when maybe other buyers are holding their EOIs firm. So you don't want to put yourself at a disadvantage. So don't adjust the valuation down on an EOI to an LOI. So in the final slide we're going to talk about is really the timeline. So when do I submit an EOI? It's a common question I get. And usually when it's a brokered process, there's a process letter which outlines deadlines and timelines, and it's very structured in terms of you have 4 weeks or 2 weeks to do this and that and all that. Whereas if it's a more informal discussion, the key comment I make to you is that EOIs need to be submitted usually within a month or a month and a half of discussions. If you're waiting 4-5 months and you're dealing directly with a seller that's not represented by an advisor, well, even though they may not be giving you information as quickly, not giving them an EOI doesn't incentivize them to move faster. So a really good thing to do, especially if you're dealing with a direct seller who's maybe moving slow in terms of giving you information, is to put a rough EOI in front of them and say, hey, this is my idea. Is this within the range? Oh, yeah, that's right. That's what I'm thinking. Okay, well, this is what I need to really formalize this. Okay, and it gives that seller the motivation to move faster. So EOIs are a great tool even for the buyer to speed up a seller when they're dragging their feet and they're not providing that information. So the best time, in my opinion, is before an EOI, take 2 to 4 weeks. Get comfortable with the information. Maybe there's a confidential information memorandum, a SIM that's prepared by the broker, or it's just the seller and he gives you his financials and some customer lists and an equipment list. But just with that information at a high level, you can kind of figure out an idea of the way you would take the beast down and how to buy the business, and that's more than enough to submit an EOI. And the moment that you submit an EOI, that really opens up the discussion. Again, it communicates your seriousness and it makes sure that you're within the same range. And if you are, then the seller is going to move faster and say, okay, here's more information. Come into my site, meet me in person. Let's have a few more calls so that you can then go from EOI to LOI within another 4 to 6 weeks. So in a brokered process, these numbers are accurate. In a non-brokered process, they may add another 2 to 4 weeks on top of these numbers. So typically for our brokered process, we'll send out the SIM. Within 4 weeks, we'll ask for initial EOIs. The EOIs are submitted. Then within the next 4 to 6 weeks, the people that we select that have met the threshold that we want to walk to the finish line with in terms of an LOI are brought along the process. They're given access to a light data room with more information. We tour the facility with them. We let them meet management over Zoom or in person, and they have access to the company for another 4 to 6 weeks, at which point in time, they should have more than enough information in 2 months, essentially, to submit a formal offer with a lot more detail. So my comment on this is if you leave the timeline too long, then the seller and the buyer's momentum slows down. And if you don't give enough time, then obviously the opposite is that you're not going to get quality EOIs. So I typically say 4 weeks is the perfect timing for an EOI, and then another 4 to 6 weeks is perfect for an LOI. So hopefully you found the video helpful. If you do have any questions, just comment in the section below, and happy to kind of get back to you as well. Or you could reach out to my LinkedIn at Robert Bezet, where we can connect and talk about an EOI that you're working on right now. But make sure that you check out part 2 of this video series, in which I'm going to be walking you through an actual EOI example and going into the sections and talking through each one. So hopefully you find that valuable as well. Thank you guys, and have a great day.